Hi, I'm Donato Mancini. I'm the author of You Must Work Harder to Write Poetry of Excellence. I've always found poetry reviews and the language of poetry reviews really peculiar. Specifically, like the strange gaps that I've always felt are there between the kinds of values that reviewers are asserting and the kinds of practices that poets actually undertake. I mean, I think we're in a kind of pretty dynamic and interesting period in poetry that in retrospect might look as actually productive as like the early 1960s, say. I think it's probably a very good time for poetry, actually. But the problem persists that the kinds of vernacular critical discourses that we have to talk about what poets are actually doing is either totally antiquated or just completely inadequate. The main thing that has to happen is that reviews should be written in other languages. New languages have to develop. Like lots of people have worked incredibly hard to develop other languages. Reviewers just have to take them up more actively. The review has to become a different genre, I think. I think it has to stop. I think the review has to stop seeing itself as just serving, like, say, the book trade as such. The review has to stop seeing itself in a whole bunch of different ways, as like advertisement for a book, or a place where the power of someone's tastes or something can be asserted. It's not so much the question of commodification, because I mean it's still a book of poetry is still a sellable object or whatever, and that's not. I don't see that as actually inherently problematic in any sense. It's actually more like perceptually, the way that specifically the really rigid and unsubtle assertions of value and taste just make essentially work to transform, to mute poetry, to dampen poetry, to stifle poetry, and to make it only like goods and gadgets. Like that, it's its only effect. It's a neato thing. It's cool. It's awesome or something, and that's actually its entire meaning and effect. The common reader, which is essentially a phantasm. It's not an actual person. There is no common reader. There's people, there's individuals who read, there's practices, institutions. There's no common reader. But in certain reviewers, the logic of this goes so far that they construct the common reader as the only legitimate addressee of poetry. So if your poetry is not showing itself to be addressing the common reader, then your poetry is not even poetry. It actually ends up being the definition of poetry, right? So there's this long collective process that's gone on through which the desires of the common reader have been defined. It's been decided what a common reader wants to read, what a common reader wants to see, what a common reader desires, their tastes, their vulnerabilities, etc. And this set of tastes and needs, in making the reviewer and the poet accountable to the common reader, this set of tastes and needs become the de facto definition of true poetry. And furthermore, it's implied or directly stated that, of course, any real poet would want to write true poetry, right? Okay, I'm going to read a section that pertains to the questions of the struggles over the definition of poetry in terms of a definition of what type of work the making of poetry actually is. It's on page 201. The section's called A Guild of Craftsmen Scientists with Magical Secrets. The definition of poetry and the poet's social role is a core stake in the position struggles within the divided field of Canadian poetry. To define the social role of poetry is to delimit the poetic field as such, to stake out what positions are licitly available to actors. It is to determine what Bourdieu terms the space of possibles. For poets in Canada, the postmodern turn alters the sociality of poetry in a way that intensifies such definitional struggles, further dividing the field. To define the space of possibles is to draw the limits of what is licit to desire in or of poetry, and so what kinds of texts can legitimately circulate under its sign. For Bourdieu, at stake is the power to impose the dominant definition of the writer. The boundary of the field is a stake of struggles. This in turn entails definition of what type of cultural labor poetics. This in turn entails a definition of what type of cultural labor poetic labor is. What is the job of the poet? Bourdieu observes correctly that poetry is the arena par excellence of struggles over job definition. Poetry reviewers continue to trip over the axial question, what does poetry do? This rests on the deeper question, what is poetry? The latter is itself an answer to the question, what form of work does a poet do? Poetry and art at large is often a cultural cipher for the acute collective longing for unalienated forms of work. When Frederick Jameson analyzes the figure of the scientist in sci-fi and towards dialectical criticism, he discovers projections of that longing. And quoting Jameson, these works rather openly express the mystique of the scientist, and by that I refer to a kind of collective folk dream about the lifestyle of the scientist himself. He doesn't do real work, yet power is his and social status as well. His remuneration is not monetary, or at the very least, money seems no object. There is something fascinating about his laboratory, the home workshop magnified to institutional dimensions, a combination of factory and clinic. Something fascinating about the way he works nights. He isn't bound by the routine of the 8-hour day. There is, moreover, the suggestion of a return to older modes of work organization, to the more personal and psychologically satisfying world of the guilds, in which the older scientist is the master and the younger one the apprentice, in which the daughter of the older man naturally becomes naturally enough the symbol of the transfer of functions, and so forth. These traits may be indefinitely enumerated and elaborated. What I want to convey is that ultimately none of this has anything to do with science itself, but is rather a distorted reflection of our own feelings and dreams about work alienated and non-alienated. It is a wish fulfillment that takes as its object a vision of ideal, or what Marcuse would call libidinally gratifying work. Such folk dreams about the labor of the special person, scientist, art genius, poet, etc., are an orienting component of poetry reviewers' aesthetic consciences and of Canadian cultural ideology at large. Field-wide, the folky labor fantasy spans both the division within Canadian poetry and broader art disciplinary divisions. Art, as a phantasmic trope, serves partly as an object fetish of the common dream of freedom from the exploitative reality of the capitalist wage contract. These agonistic, sublimated hopes relate directly to those expressed elsewhere as gambling addictions, the mania for lotteries, and celebrity worship. Poetry has long experienced a constant, internal crisis of self-justification. There are countless defenses of poetry in the history of poetics, a crisis intensified in the current long neoliberal cultural moment, when every social practice is under pressure to justify itself in brute fiscal terms. In one sense, reviewers try to construct poetry as a form of labor ethically defensible within a neoliberal economist value ideology. For the same reason, they also use reviews to shame poets to get a real job, to write poetry in a way that represents poetry as both morally and economically defensible. Sorry, I'm just fucking this up. For the same reason, they also use reviews to shame poets to get a real job, to write poetry in a way that represents poetry as both a morally and economically defensible form of labor. For poetry as work to be conscionable in these terms, for the poet-worker to gain aesthetico-moral innocence or capitalist absolution, it has to be possible for poets and their poet reviewers to imagine themselves in a distinctive solidarity with other workers. Just resentment and just hatred of alienated labor, or the desire for alternate categories of human value, are sources of guilt. If poets should slave over their line endings, as Shane Nielsen says, the boss of an economist aesthetic conscience holds the editorial whip. Yet the poet, like the celebrity, is also a phantasm of a subject liberated from alienated work. Like the scientist of science fiction that Jameson describes, therefore, this poet is a special, non-alienated worker. The poet is not figured as one of the losers of capitalism, not a line cook at Wendy's, nor a recyclables binner, but as a specialized, sometimes elite, skilled worker. Plumber, artisan, scientist, athlete, scholar, sculptor, blacksmith, wordsmith. As R.J. McSween, poet and Catholic priest who co-founded the Antigonish Review, writes, scattered through this volume are these short, finely worked passages of poem. Scattered through the volume are these short, finely worked passages, poems of painter and carver, economically conchable, productive toil that is yet libidinally gratifying. When a notion of pleasure finds its way into the base categories of a reviewer's idiolect, it is most often the pleasure of the Sabbath, virtuous delectation fully earned in the restraints of sweaty diligence. In 2005, Brick magazine published a poetic statement by Don Patterson, author of numerous collections and appointed in 2008 Officer of the Order of the British Empire, called The Dark Art of Poetry, premised on confidently job-essentialist statements about poetry as labor. Mournful of senses of solidarity, cultural pertinence, and confident identity, which Patterson fantasizes poets had in simpler times, he argues that poets could recreate these conditions through a neo-guildhood. Patterson's Guild of Poets is a curious hybrid of peer-reviewed science, artisanal guild, and occult priesthood. Patterson writes, only plumbers can plumb, roofers roof, and drummers drum. Only poets can write poetry. Restoring the science of verse-making might restore our self-certainty in this matter, and naturally resurrect a guild that would soon find it had some secrets worth preserving. Initially, Patterson associates poetry with skilled manual work, with craftsmanship or skilled labor, rather than bookish, highbrow, or abstract sedentary toil. Patterson does not write that only geneticists gene, only academics academe, or only psychologists psych. To regain economic dignity, the poet becomes a type of worker among other skilled workers, far from the twin objections of brutal factory labor or abstracted office labor. Nor, however, does Patterson allow that a poet can be both plumber and poet at the same time. The poet cannot be an interdisciplinarian, a total fusion of job with unity. The poet cannot be an interdisciplinarian. A total fusion of job with a unitary aesthetic identity is requisite, as the poet is also a religious or magical worker of vocation. To restore the science of verse-making would be to regain the powers that supposedly once gave poets the occult mesmeric power of a priesthood. Poets' secrets, the practical rhetorical skills, their science, would be aimed at nothing except producing value for poetry through its irrational, libidinal veneration. Poet, be like a celebrity. In an art sociological sense, Patterson is not mistaken. As Bourdieu writes, the power of the magician is a legitimate imposture, collectively misrecognized and hence recognized. Similarly, the work of art, like religious goods or services, amulets, or various sacraments, receives value only from the collective belief as collective misrecognition, collectively produced and reproduced. Yes, if poets want a secure paycheck, rather than operate a critical... Yes, if poets want a secure paycheck, rather than operate as a critical social practice or an exploratory epistemology, poetry must aspire to become the apparatus of deceit, a no-budget spiritual spectacular. Patterson's Magical Science Guild has these demagogic implications, and suggests furthermore a closed circle of members with absolute regulatory power to decide which products are honored with the name of poetry, and which cultural workers merit initiation. One underlying premise of the reviewer's idiolect is that linguistic communication is expression. The expressive communicative paradigm of meaning requires not only, as Michael Davison critiques, that poetry exists to reflect the poet's mind as he or she comes to grips with political and social contradictions, but that the poetic meaning is an expression of something other than and something formulated prior to, rather than something produced in or inseparable from, the poem. Although reviewers often write sandwiched abstractions in sentences such as, his craft is extremely well polished, the notion extends backwards from the cultural product to that legendary place of toil and to the poet. The imagined work activity expresses the vocational identity of the worker. Form is the vehicle or vessel of a message, prior content. That content is often... Form is the vehicle or vessel of a message, a prior content. That content is often the poet, him or herself. Yes, the fact that poets like Milton Acorn, David Haggett, Ken Babstock, Patrick Lane, and Kate Braid, not to mention Jesus Christ, worked as carpenters is often taken to help explain their writing or working ethos and the form of their poetry. The scrupulous work habits such poets must have acquired as carpenters are supposedly transferred to their work as verse makers. Aesthetic reasoning elaborates this analogy a long way from its initial root analogy of poetry as craft In 1990, George Woodcock praises the quality of Milton Acorn's poetic craftsmanship through an extended analogy to carpentry. Because the analogy is rooted in biographical fact, it takes on an irrefutable common sense character. I'm quoting, "The sense of fine crafting that in another aspect of his life we are told characterized his work as a good carpenter. There is no loose jointing, either verbal or intellectual, in his finished poetry, no real incoherence, everything fits." A central component of Woodcock's argument is his assertion of the quality of Acorn's poetry by reference to Acorn's credibility as a normal economic actor. Acorn, the poet, is credited for having been economically productive before he took up poetry. A masculine master in both spheres, Acorn did not turn to poetry from sloth, unemployment, or incompetence. What Woodcock values as tight verbal or intellectual jointing or coherence thus gains a positive moral resonance within the terms of an economist work ethic. Acorn brings home the poetic bacon, as it were, and so aesthetic conscience is permitted quiet admiration of his poetry. Over a decade later, Zachariah Wells discovers the same worksman-craftsman ethos in an all-male group of poets, including Ken Babstock, Pete Trower, Joe Denman, Peter Richardson, and Adam Getty. These 5 poets have markedly distinct voices and techniques for approaching manual labor as the subject of their poetry. What they share is a commitment to their readers and to the art of poetry itself. This commitment consists of a resistance to the literary preciousness and self-indulgent esoteric obscurity, and an emphasis on craft and shared humanity. As workers themselves, they respect a job well done and the work that goes into a finely forged tool or weapon. A crafts guild must regulate the products that bear its stamp to protect its cultural and economic capital. To this end, aesthetic conscience can morally bribe itself into believing it works with an inductive objectivity, while it actually abstracts the standards of quality from the poetry it has first judged intuitively as good. Rationalization often comes later in the sequence of conscience. As reviewers often do, Wells here defines in negative and positive terms what he believes poetry is. Like Woodcock above, who grants value to Acorn's poetry because of its apparent work ethic, Wells equates a work ethical imperative with an actual definition of poetry, commitment to their readers, or commitment to the common reader. Because these men were true workers in the past, they have virtuous aesthetic morality, and what they produce is true poetry. In particular, they respect the work that goes into a finely forged tool or weapon, not the effeminate jewelry of literary preciousness, the sinful onanism of the self-indulgent, nor the soft-skinned hands of esoteric obscurity. The poetry's value is in specifically instrumental utility. Poetry is a weapon or a tool. In reviews such as Wells's, a morality of labor produces the fetish of true poetry. Poetry is valued as the product of an ethically correct labor as such. As Barthes writes, writing is now to be saved not by virtue of what it exists for, but by what it has cost. Barthes and reviewers like Wells echo Marx in Capital. As values, all commodities are only definite masses of congealed labor time. Tom Wayman correctly observed the taboo in Canlit against accurately depicting daily work. And yet, in the ideology of Canadian poetry reviews, that suppressed work vengefully returns in a variety of powerful, sublimated forms.